Now, we're going to do something a little bit different because as charming as I am, I know I can probably tend to grade after, what has it been, 4 hours? So we've got somebody else who's going to actually host this panel, but we are keeping with the journalism line. So it's another journalist. His name is Petrok Wilton. He's going to lead this panel. So please join me in welcoming Petrok to the stage.
Thank you. Hi guys, and thank you very much for listening this afternoon. Well, there we go. Our panelists are the important ones, so I'd like to welcome my panelists right now to the stage. You've all heard, I think, already from Ranjit, Voola, the Director of Poverty Alleviation and Profitability Group at the University of Sydney Business School, as well as Vlad Sohkin, the photographer, who, of course, whose work we just saw. Some very powerful shots. Thanks, Ranjit. Of course, Dermott, we've just heard from, so please welcome her back to the stage. And Kristy Sanderson, the CEO of Voice. And also joining us for the first time on stage this afternoon is Yvette, Crafti, a humanitarian aid professional. She works in the field of international human response to disasters. Panelists, thank you all for joining me. Okay, one of the, I guess, most important things about this panel is that everybody on it works in the field, right at the front lines of their respective areas of interest. So I'd like to just find out briefly from each panelist what got you here today, what motivated you to go right out there onto the front lines, taking the photographs, doing the research. Yvette, let's start with you.
I suppose as a young person, when you grow up in a community that's imbued with social justice values, as I did myself and my family, I found that the work that I do has just become an extension of my beliefs and my values. I don't think there could be anything else I do day to day where I wasn't actualising my values and living my values to earn an income, which is the lucky benefit that I get to do at the same time.
Wonderful, thank you. Kristy.
Yeah, I kind of am similar. I often get asked when I'm telling stories about the people that we work with, and people will say, how do you work with these? How do you do this every day? And my response is honestly the same back. How do you not? These things happen whether you're aware of them or not, and these people are in these situations whether you choose to kind of do something about it or not. And this is why I kind of have always been compelled to do it. And everybody has different ways of contributing. This is the way I want to. And everybody has different skills and different approaches, and it's not that mine is right. So you kind of have to find your way and where do your skills fit?
Go ahead, Tara.
I'm actually going to tell a little story about how I specifically got involved in counter-trafficking with an emphasis on forced labor. About 10 years ago, I was actually a teacher in rural Thailand. And at one point, one of my co-teachers opened up to me about her husband, who she had lost the year before. And she told me how we lived in a community where there was a lot of out-migration, people leaving because there weren't a lot of labor opportunities within the community. So she told me how he had traveled to Japan to work in the construction industry. He was gone for a couple years, and when he came back, he was broken. He was drug addicted. He had no more financial resource than he had before he left. And more than anything, he felt like a failure to his family, and he ended up taking his own life. Now, at the time, I had heard of trafficking, but I had only heard about it within the context of sex trafficking. So even at that time, I wasn't aware that it could happen in the context of labor and that it could happen to men and boys. While I didn't recognize it as what it was at that time, I recognized it as something, an issue related to migration. And as someone who has I've grown up in Africa and Asia and moving around my whole life, I think it's a fundamental right for us to be able to go where we want, to do what we want, and to be able to do it safely. And I didn't want to see that happen to any more individuals or have that impact on any more families.
Thank you. Vlad.
Do you remember a photograph of a Vietnamese photographer, Nick Wood, a girl, like naked girl running from the napalm bombing? So this photograph helped to stop the Vietnamese war. And when I was a photography student, one of my teachers showed us, to the students this photo and said, well, that was a time when photography could change something. Unfortunately, this is not happening anymore. But I still believe that maybe photographs can't stop the wars anymore, but at least they can change lives of some people. And I've seen it through my work. So I'm doing what I'm doing, I think, just because I think I still want to show, because a lot of people are not aware of what happens in the other parts of the world. And also, I'm doing this because I can't not to do it, probably. So I think I just, and I've seen a positive change as well. So maybe not like on a big scale, but at least some people's life will change. So,
Thank you very much. Ranjit.
I guess my parents are Christian missionary doctors back home in India for the last 30 years. So when I was doing business studies and become an academic, I've been asking myself, how can I be like them? And so what I've decided, or I guess I asked the same question I asked my students, which is, where does your passion meet the world's greatest needs? So my passion is teaching and researching, and the world's greatest need that I can do something with is poverty. And I think it's really important to start the process of business students understanding what poverty means, and at least having a conversation on that. So that's why.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Okay, I'd like to come back to some of your personal stories a little bit later on. But for the moment, let's go to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Kristy, you and I were talking earlier about the fact that sometimes it's difficult to find those connections between very large international organisations and what people are doing on the front lines. So to each of our panellists, your thoughts on the SDGs, do they really provide a practical blueprint in the post-2015 agenda for helping to build a safe and equal society? And as a follow-up, there's a very strong narrative around the private sector involvement, I think, in the SDGs. So to what extent do you think that's realistic? To what extent have you worked with the private sector in your own areas? And could there be more collaboration there? Kristy, by all means, let's start with you.
I think the UN Development Goals have a very strong purpose to provide us goals. But, I mean, with all of my work, what I think is really important is how those goals are implemented, how they're achieved. And it's really clear that what is needed is a very clear steps to achieve those goals. And this is what's missing, and this is what we have people like you, and we need brains like yours to think about how we do achieve these goals. It's lovely to have them, but it's not good enough. What you need to do is figure out how we actually achieve them. And that's what, I try to do it every day, one by one, but there must be better ways to do it en masse, and it's really important for us to have proper, strong conversations and to utilise the resources that are actually there at a bigger, larger UN or macroeconomic scale to make sure that there are clear ways to achieve these goals, and that when you're saying stopping poverty, that it is actually making a difference in the lives of people affected by poverty, and that it's not just a theoretical or statistical thing.
Thank you. Tara, you mentioned that your organisation, IOMX, is working very closely on goal number 8. But in more general terms, your thoughts on the SDGs, are they a kind of practical blueprint for a future?
I definitely join the camp of people that find them to be more aspirational. That said, I do want to highlight, for anyone who's maybe not as familiar, first we had the Millennium Development Goals, and they were launched 15 years ago, and they were actually created largely by experts from developed countries, and they were targeting development in developing countries. Now, what's different about the SDGs, which will be launched in January to replace these, is that for the past 3 years, 193 member states have been participating in producing these goals. So unlike the former ones, these are actually global goals. They are universal, and they are just as relevant here in Australia, in the US, as they are in Thailand, Cambodia, Uganda, Afghanistan. So I think that, while they are aspirational, they're incredibly powerful. And in my line of work, human trafficking is a really sensitive subject. especially in places where the exploitation is taking place, right? It's easier to sort of want to protect victims and defend, but to actually change our lifestyles or change, it's hard. And so to be able to have these policy-level influential leaders coming out and saying that they are committed to ending forced labor, that is a massively useful tool in my toolbox. And I'm going to hold them to that when I ask for them to participate and to support the activities that IOMX is doing directly, but also more broadly that the International Organization for Migration is doing around the world. So.
Thank you. Vlad, we've seen just now evidence of your astonishing frontline work, but I know that you've also worked with a number of international organisations. Again, how far are the SDGs a kind of practical way forward?
Well, I can't say about all SDGs, but for me, it's important that, for the last year, I've been working on the climate change stories, mostly in the Pacific. So it is, how to say, I'm a bit worried. Yeah, so it's embarrassing. I'm a bit. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. How far do you think the SDGs are a practical blueprint to take us forward for the next 15 years to a more equal and a safer future?
I'm just not feeling well, I think. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. That's fine.
I might just start with the critique of the SDGs, because it's all good saying good things about the SDGs, but as an academic, I think it's important to see the critiques. There are two main ones. The first one is there are 17 of them, and one of the critiques is too many, right? And it's too ambitious. Well, it was said the same thing about the Millennium Development Goals, and in terms of poverty, there's been huge progress, although we haven't actually fulfilled it. The other big critique that's happening is essentially we're following the same model that is basically destroying the earth, which is growth, right? The SDGs are doing that. But the real key is, I think ideal situation would be to stop growth, as one of my colleagues will say later, but that's not ideal because it affects jobs and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I would ask you a question. If not the SDGs, which one then? 193 countries have signed up for it.
All right. Yvette, I know you and I were speaking about the SDGs a little bit earlier. What are your thoughts?
I guess I'm in a slightly different position to some of my colleagues on the couch in that I don't work in development and I work in a sector that is sometimes seen to work in opposition or against or in a silo, opposed to development, which is the humanitarian landscape of disasters and emergencies. And you wouldn't think that they would be necessarily oppositional, but for some reason the lay of the land is that we have disasters and complex emergencies over here, and we have international development, sustainable development sort of over here. And it's bizarre because a lot of the same organisations work in the same space, but operationally and from a funding perspective, donors actually will fund disasters and emergencies, or they will fund development programs and initiatives. And so we sort of never the twain shall meet, and it's really bizarre, but that is how it is. So given that that is the landscape, the work that I do is in the pointy end of disasters and emergencies. So I had a look through the Sustainable Development Goals, as you do, and they've been popping up on my Facebook in the last few weeks. But I noticed something really stark, and that's that there's no disaster sensitisation in the SDGs. So immediately it strikes me. Where is the mention of the fact that, okay, a natural disaster can come along and undo 15 or 20 years of development work? I mean, to me, that's the first thing that I'd look to. And you see these words resilience kind of fed in. Resilience, what is that? I mean, it's a buzzword. We talk about resilience a lot. It's basically how do we sensitise our development programs so that they're disaster proof, so that when the earthquake comes along in Kathmandu or the cyclone Pam in the Pacific, how do we make communities and cities resilient to these shocks? But the SDGs don't really specify what kind of shocks. They don't say climate change-induced shocks, natural disaster. They don't say economic shocks or crime or terrorism. They just say resilience, resilient cities, resilient communities, and I find that a little bit lacking. But then it kind of speaks to something even a little bit more stark to me, which is that more so the natural disasters which get all the glory and the attention and the media and the funding, these protracted, complex emergencies that we respond to day in, day out, and communities suffer through for decades in some places, are absent from the SDGs, and conflict and protracted emergencies are going to undo so much more work than a natural disaster, and there is no attention paid to conflict. Simply to say that the only mention I could find of conflict in the working groups and the panels and the background papers on the SDGs that mentioned conflict and peace were to say that with economic growth comes peace as a natural consequence. Poverty is the driver for conflict, and that was it. And it's very stark to me that that is not simply the case if we look at countries like Ukraine and Syria, which are middle-income countries and which are wholesale destruction. So to me, the SDGs are quite lacking in that they don't take on board the role of peacemakers and the role of conflict in undoing development work and in decimating the environment and decimating communities. So yeah, watch this space.
And of course, conflict is such a key driver of the migration and refugee issue, which we should come back to later on. But just to follow up with the second part of the question, and I think Ranjit will start with you for this, that there's been so much dialogue around the SDGs in the critical role of the private sector with collaboration going forwards. I was reading a piece from the London School of Economics this morning which suggested that the SDGs simply were not practicable without improved private sector collaboration. Ranjit, your thoughts on the...
Yeah, sure. How many of you guys don't have bank accounts? Can I see a hand? Just imagine for a while that you don't have a bank account. How would your life be different? Pretty dramatically, I would imagine. There are 2.5 billion people in the world who do not have bank accounts. So, their life is seriously, disadvantaged because of that. So imagine a poor woman anywhere in the world who has to travel one day to go to the bank in the city, right? And remember that they have daily labor, so she has to travel there and come back. So what Vodafone and Safaricom did in Kenya was basically put the bank in their pocket through a mobile phone. It had pretty dramatic effects in terms of financial literacy, and at the same time, they actually made profit of, I think close to about $250 to $280 million. Another very interesting case study in terms of inclusiveness and the private sector is in India. There are 210 million rural women who do not have sanitary pads. That has huge impact on their lives. So some of the impacts, if you do not have sanitary pads, is that they don't go to school when they're menstruating for 5 days. So that's 50 days in a year. So what happens if your children don't go to school for 50 days? It has dramatic effects on the education of those kids, right? And so what this entrepreneur did, there are many entrepreneurs, what this entrepreneur did was she actually came up with a sanitary pad made from banana waste. And she sold the technology to the actual women in the village, and those village women actually supplied that. So this entrepreneur made the money by selling the technology, and those women actually made money by selling it forward. And just a very simple that we don't even think about, right? That not having sanitary pads is just not unimaginable here. Has dramatic impact on women around the world.
Now, and I know our panelists have different degrees of involvement in the private sector, but would any of you like to speak to the... okay, let's go Tara and then Yvette.
Yeah, so I'd actually like to speak on a couple aspects. First of all, I'd like to define the private sector. So when I think about the private sector, I think about major companies, but I also think about individuals who have skill sets that we need. IOMX, we are a nonprofit, so we actually receive funding from the US Agency for International Development. But for every dollar we receive, we did some calculations that we actually have around, we can give $10 of value based on our partnerships. And most of this is coming from in-kind, pro bono, or even crazy low bono services. I mean, our logo itself was actually designed by a graphic designer, a creative guy here in Sydney, who I've never met. I'm hoping to meet on Monday. But, remotely, he donated his time and designs for us. So photographers, for sure, anyone involved in the creatives. Another thing that often, we don't think about is translation, right? I mean, we produce things in English. We have Thai capacity in-house. I have colleagues in a variety of countries. But if people just have the time and speak other languages to translate tweets and social media, I mean, there are so many ways that individuals can get involved. On another scale, we are, as a communications campaign, it's important for us to be at the forefront of media and technology. I mean, what we're seeing now is that increasingly people are connected and they're online. So for us, ICT is major. So we've partnered with Microsoft to create a unique platform to connect individual givers with individual victims. We're exploring a partnership with IBM now to look at how we can strengthen networks between domestic workers, because we found the more connected they are to each other, the more empowered they are to improve their circumstances. So the more creative you are, the more opportunities there are for us to work together to make a difference.
Sorry. I just wanted to add to that a little bit about understanding your role as consumers and just the role of consumers generally, especially in something like human trafficking, which is a business, and it's something that people often overlook. I worked to stop human trafficking for 5 years in the UN, and it's really important to get that there's a business with supply, which is often where all of the development work goes and the prevention work goes into how do we prevent supply. But as long as there's demand, the supply will come. And so we've got to look at the demand. And, it bewilders me that you have things like dolphin-free tuna when you don't have things like slave-free tuna, when some of the worst forms of trafficking I've ever come across have been men into the fishing industry. They're not your general idea of what a victim is. They're not, often it's a female or a child. And these men act differently as victims too. They feel like they've done something stupid, that they've been tricked and that they let themselves be tricked. But as consumers, it's really important to understand, what is the impact of what we're buying and what demand are we actually creating? And that's another way that I think we can make a difference, and that private sector especially can make a difference. Is it just profits? Are we looking for the cheapest good, or are we looking for the cheapest sustainable good, or the cheapest sustainable and socially friendly way of achieving something?
So again, in the disaster and emergency space, without the private sector, there'd be a complete shortfall of all the types of commodities that need to be provided to people after they've lost everything. So from shelter kits provided by IKEA, which is no surprise because they're flat pack and you build them yourself with lots of Allen keys, to food commodities, to non-food items, pots and pans, the whole host of basic needs that people need to have met have to be supplied, and in many instances are supplied by the private sector. There is just one big alarm bell that in disasters and emergencies kind of falls over that, and that's the harmonisation of what those goods are. So you often see after a disaster an influx of sort of offcuts and second-hand goods and donations and items that come from well-intentioned businesses, big and small, and individuals, but there is a need for three things when those kinds of items are being supplied to a disaster response, and that is that they are asked for, that they're requested and required and needed by the communities and by the agencies that are operating. B, that the items are uniform in some way, so you don't create tensions between communities when this community received this type of stock and this community received this type of stock and this is a little bit better, and you can create a lot of tensions and disharmony. And thirdly, that the items meet the international standards so that they are actually beneficial, that they meet agreed standards based on the various internationally agreed standards that we have, which is namely SPHERE, a set of humanitarian standards. And so it's very important that that private sector inputs after a disaster do come from a request and aren't just sort of given with all the goodwill, but that they actually meet the needs of the people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think the relationship the other way around is also really important, not only to the private sector, but what the private sector can learn from the nonprofits. We teach in business strategy that you should understand the needs of wants of consumers and meet them and all that kind of stuff. Who is better to understand the needs of the consumers than the nonprofits? So I think for-profit companies who are going to, I guess, do business with these 4 billion people who earn less than $5 a day, I think the real critical aspect to all that strategy is to be able to partner in a cohesive way with the nonprofit.
Sorry for the...
No, that's all. That's all.
Something is sometimes like I work mostly like with visuals. With what? Yeah. No.
There we go.
Yeah. So mostly I work with visuals. So some of the questions is like it's too technical for me. So well, honestly, so I was a bit, I don't know about the private sector. Like I also don't really work with the private sector, but I've seen some positive things that led to some positive changes. For example, in Papua New Guinea, Digicel, for example, corporation, they opened a center for women. So they support, for example, women's rights, or let's say Oil Search Health Foundation, right? So they do explore oil in Papua New Guinea, but they also had their like health foundation, and I've been in the area where they operate in the Southern Highlands near Lake Kutubu, and they set up really interesting things. So they had like a lot of like problems with malaria. So they had they have a program called Marasin Store Keeper. So Marasin is a medicine. So they work with the communities, and they in every village there is a woman and has a small hut, which is and she is responsible for if someone has malaria or symptoms of malaria, would go to there, and she has all the tests, she has everything. So that's a really nice initiative. So I think like I'd love to see more.
Collaboration. Thank you. I want to make sure we have a good amount of time for Q&A. There are some more issues I'd like to get into based on what we've discussed so far. But let me just close off the kind of formal half by taking it back to the personal level. Each of you works again in the field at the forefront of things, and we talk about safety in a global sense. But that exposes each of you also to risks, to insecurities that, of course, you wouldn't find here in Australia. And Vlad, I thought we'd start with you on this, because having seen those photographs of things like police brutality, I can't imagine that police forces are terribly keen on you taking those photographs. How do you deal with threats to your own person?
Oh, one of the photos that I showed here on the screen where police were beating a man.
Yeah.
So how it happened? I was working on something else in the Highlands on a sorcery violence story, and then but then I had an assignment from the United Nations as well to cover police brutality at the same time. So I was like, it's Papua New Guinea, you can't really predict what's going to happen. So I did several things at the same time. So I was in a really remote town of Papua New Guinea, and then I saw like a man was chased by the police, and then the crowd was following them. In someone's yard, they caught the man and they started to beat him, and then the crowd came and they were like watching, and then I saw it and I started to take pictures. In a few minutes they realized that there is like a big white guy out of nowhere taking photos. So
with a big
they
camera,
were with a big camera. They were like frightened as well, and so they started to scream at me like, stop taking pictures. And one policeman told like, who are you? Like, what are you doing here? Like, and I don't know why, but I said, maybe it was like adrenaline, I don't know. Instead of just putting my camera down, I said like, well, I documenting police brutality, and what you're doing is illegal.
Wow.
So, I don't know, like, and so he just said, delete all the photos, like stop taking pictures. I stopped taking pictures, but I didn't want to delete any pictures. So, and he just like pulled his gun and shot above my head. Everyone started to run. I have my, everything like shaking my hands, and I said, okay, I'll delete the pictures. He's like, no, it's too late. So he put me in the car. The guy they were beating, he was already there on the floor. covered in blood. They drove me to the police station, and on the way, of course, I called some of my friends, some people from the UN, saying that this. By the time we reached the police station, already the police commander knew what's going on. They were like, they didn't like the situation as well as he said, we will release you straight away, just delete the photos. So I formatted the card, and I was released, but before I left, they said, you wanted to see the police brutality? We will show you. And they would like continue to beat this guy. He was screaming. Of course, I recovered the pictures. Yeah, but then,
Of course.
But Papua New Guinea is really interesting country. Like, and you know, when I first approached a police commander, so I had the letter from the UN, please help, like, you know, facilitate our photographer to document. And they wrote human rights issues without specifying. Okay. And so the police commander, when I came and asked access to the prison cells, so I asked him, like, he asked me, what sort of human rights issues you want to document here? And I said, I can't lie, so I said, well, police brutality. Oh, we have plenty of that. It's okay.
All right.
Like, I mean, they just have different, you know, perspective, I guess. So.
Tara, I'm sure that also dealing in trafficking, there are some powerful vested interests there. What have been your experiences with kind of personal safety and security?
Actually, so for me, I'm the least, I basically face the least risk of anyone that I work with. And a lot of that is I'm based in Bangkok, I travel, but I'm not going to areas that are incredibly disaster prone or anything like that. But what I wanted to highlight with security and more my organization's approach is, because trafficking is so sensitive, there are a couple factors that we have to think about. And I suppose another thing is that when we produce materials, we're producing them in country for audiences there, right? We're not going in, filming or shooting and then showing it elsewhere, which arguably doesn't work anymore because of the internet anyways. But so we have to make sure that we are invited by communities, that we're not putting anyone who is participating in our programs at risk, be it the subjects, be it the cameramen. So we actually go through many layers of permissions processes, from the individual to community leadership, so that we can best ensure that it is always a safe environment that we're operating in. And then also, we go to great lengths to make sure that we have community endorsement from the national to community government levels, because even once the videos are produced, often the people who are using them for outreach purposes at the community-based level can face being persecuted by local authorities, by local businesses. So for them to have tools that have logos from their national counterparts, from law enforcement in that community, is really helpful for them to say, you know, it's like sort of de facto permission, so that it reduces the risk that they face in really speaking loudly about this issue at a local level.
Thank you.
I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the importance of risk management if you're going to do any type of social good work. And I really want to say intention to do good is not good enough, because I've seen so many people do harm. And I just think it's so important for you to learn the skills of how to assess risks for everything that you do, and to manage risk, and to be able to always think constantly about how to mitigate the risks of any situation you're in, not only for yourself, but also for my staff and also for the clients that I'm working with. You have to have holistic risk. And I guess I'm at the point now where in any scenario that I think I'm walking into, I am constantly assessing what are all the things that could go wrong first, and how I can mitigate those spontaneously, but also as an organisation or in my approach to development. How can I mitigate the risk of doing harm to anyone or to anything? And it's really the first step that you need to make. And because, you know, your own personal risks, you know, if you're not around to do the good, then you're not going to be any good to anyone. So you've really got to constantly to weigh up the benefits of going into an extremely risky situation, which is what we constantly do working in areas where people are in crisis, but making sure that you're as safe as possible, and that that what could go wrong isn't going to mitigate the benefits that could be achieved. And you've constantly got to be making these decisions and trying to mitigate those risks. And you don't see this process. You do discuss it with my staff. I discuss it with my staff all the time. But it's a really important step that is often overlooked when you're thinking about doing good. When you're thinking about achieving the goals that we're talking about, you do need to understand the risk of possible harm that could come to anybody involved.
Sobering, thank you. Yvette?
I'm really mindful that my mum's in the audience, so if she can just block her ears while I talk about what it's like. Last year there were 200 incidents, security incidents, which harmed humanitarian aid workers in the field. That was 350 humanitarian aid workers, most of them national staff. Kidnapping was the number one method of choice by people targeting aid workers directly. There's also shootings, roadside bombs, IEDs, the whole host of types of attacks which increasingly are on the rise, where humanitarian aid workers are directly targeted because of the work that they do, which means that humanitarian aid work in the field is now in the top 5 most dangerous professions worldwide, I think, after like deep sea fishing and, some forestry and mining stuff. And these stats come from a website called aidworkersecurity.org, which is a portal for aid worker security. That was a drop last year of 30% on the previous year of attacks, and the reason being is that organisations are now getting really spooked and are not going places that are insecure and hostile because the safety and security of staff comes first. So operations are being scaled back. I've just been working on the Yemen response for the UN based in Jordan because the entire humanitarian operation was evacuated. So we ran the response and coordinated it remotely until we had an airport landing capacity of the size of aircraft that was able to evacuate staff that were in country at the time. So running an entire humanitarian operation from a different country because NGOs were too scared to operate there and they couldn't move because they were targets. But that's the big stuff. There's also the really mundane stuff, like being sick all the time, and all the malaria and the dysentery and the dengue and the constant diarrhea, and it's just constant.
But don't be put off. It's fine.
Am I right?
Don't.
Am I right? Cambodia. We spent years in Cambodia. I mean, it's just crazy. It's also, the mental health issues, burnout, alcoholism, drug dependency. I mean, all of this is really rife in the aid community. It's like a work hard, play hard. You've got to be the toughest. You've got to be the most resilient. And often that highlights when you're not personally resilient. The Guardian's been doing a really great series lately on aid worker mental health, burnout, harassment, abuse and exploitation, sort of all linked, all the operational risks that you face as a humanitarian professional in the field. But there's also this thing of coming home, which has also kind of got its own dangers. And I learned this recently, you produce adrenaline when it's like some activity that's happened that stimulates all this adrenaline in your brain, fight or flight or fright. And, cortisol is something which you can produce for a much, much, much longer period of time. But it's something that you produce when you're away in a foreign environment or you're operating in a new context and new sights and new smells and what have you. So for anyone who's travelled for a long period of time and then come back home, that feeling of the post-travelling blues, that's actually your brain stopping production of cortisol. So it's not just the blues, it's real and it's chemical and it's your brain. So this coming home and slowing down, exhaustion, I've slept for the last 3 days, I'm still completely exhausted. Sleeping, flatness, lethargy, it's not just being sad and depressed and no one understands me, but it's real, it's very real. And finding that your friends and your family at home are, like, on the one hand really, really interested, but they're not at all really interested. It's really hard. So they're the mundane things that you face, but...
That's why I don't have home and never slow down.
They're like, how was it? You go,
Also,
yeah, well,
do more panels, because these guys are very interested. Yeah. Ranjit.
So I'm an academic researcher, so I haven't been in an unsafe situation. But what I can get you is probably one of the most insightful things that happened to me was to understand from this poor woman, the expert, about what is safe and inclusive, what it is to be. And so I was interviewing her, and she was earning less than $1.25 a day, and she took a microfinance loan, and she had a small shop in her house, a really small one. And so I was saying, and she apparently income-wise, she was doing really well. So I was, prodding her on, are you really excited about the amount of money you're getting and all that? And then, but she didn't want to answer that question. She was saying, I'm really happy about talking to other people in the village. And I was like, talk about the money. And she was talking about talking to other people in the village. And then my co-researcher pointed out, you know what? For them, that is being safe and inclusive. To be able, for this woman, because she has a small business, to be able to go there and talk to people was being safe and inclusive.
Thank you. All right, I definitely have, yep, there's more.
There are some brilliant organisations based in Australia that deal specifically with field worker mental health, and I just wanted to mention a couple. One's based in Canberra called Response Psychological, and the other is in Melbourne, Mandala Foundation, and they are specialising in field worker mental health, so for anyone who wants to access.
Thank you. All right, I do have more questions, but I would like to give the audience a chance for a couple of open Q&A ones. If anyone is keen, please come to the mic. We only ask that you restrict yourselves to questions and not statements. Let's start on the right and then go left.
Okay. Hey guys, so it sounds like you're doing such great work, and I love to hear it all. And I just wanted to know, it seems, I guess, on this side you have much more risks than being at university. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, what are some key experiences that have made all that hard work, all those risks worthwhile? All that pain, the blues, all these experiences. What's one key experience for you that just made, wow, I contributed to that?
Thank you. Pick.
I mean, it's really hard to pinpoint one. Most development workers and humanitarian workers can remember an incident or a time or a case in particular that probably traumatised them more than others. But it is obviously, it's very fulfilling. Not only, I mean, it's quite selfish. You do get a lot out of helping people and being able to see, I helped this person get into a house. I mean, there's a lot of selfish altruism in that. That you can feel altruistic, but is anyone really actually altruistic? And so it is more selfish than you would anticipate. I think what you're looking for is a dramatic story, and there's lots of them that I can tell you about. There's one right now, a lady who came to us in the community. We were talking to somebody else, and she came to us with her brand new baby of 2 days old, and she said, I need help. And without talking to her, it's very easy to dismiss her. She seems okay, she's in a community. She had been sold by her mum at the age of about 8, and her adopted mother, or her trafficker, made her do domestic work for a while, and then she was forced into sex work to earn money for the family. It was actually bar work that is often then coerced into sex work. And she had been a sex worker from the age of 10, and she'd had 3 babies. So when I met her, she's 23 now, and she's had 3 other babies, all of which were taken off her, and she doesn't know where any of them are. She was homeless. She actually was picked up by the police for an unknown reason. I think she said her friend was staying with her, and they just came and collected them and took them to jail. And she was in jail for 7 months and was released at 7 months because they realised she was 7 months pregnant and that she was going to need to have a baby. So they let her out to have her baby, and she had nowhere to go, nothing to do, because to earn income she had to be a sex worker. That's what she knew, and she didn't know anything else, but having just had a baby was very limiting to do that. And the options for her to sell her baby are just plentiful, unfortunately. And also the desire for her to do that, to potentially give the chance of her baby having a better life, is very real. And you can see how this happens and why it would happen. And the difference is, paying her rent for 1 month so that she can, or a couple of months, so that she can have what we would take for granted as maternity leave, so she can not work for a little while we can figure out longer term solutions for her, is huge and makes such a big difference. And it's, $20 for a room for her. And so we're talking $40 to give her that break, to stop her from trafficking her child, and to having the pressure to traffic her child. So my job is rewarded every day by the fact that we can give direct assistance to that one person. And it's much, much more difficult because I have worked in much broader things that are also making a difference and that make longer term, awareness raising differences or policy level differences. It's much harder to see why you do it. And so I think it's easier for me to work directly with people.
Thank you. Ranjit.
Yeah, you rightly pointed out that this side of the panel doesn't have much to do with poverty. Absolutely. And I think that's exactly probably the mindset we have to change, right? It doesn't matter what you do. I'm an academic, right? I'm not in the forefront of poverty. And, but what can I do? Well, what I can do in terms of eradicating poverty eventually is to educate future business leaders. And that's exactly the mindset we want to ask you. It doesn't matter what you do. Think differently, and you can do it.
Thank you. We are running very close to time. Yeah, okay. We might get one more question, but please do approach our panelists during the rest of the day, track them down, ask any more questions as the day moves on. You, sir.
So, hello, I am Adnan Hasnat, I'm year 10, and I am part of a group called the Stem Cell Club, which teaches basic programming, engineering, and talk with Dr. News and everything, blah, blah. And the question I wanted to ask you is that, what exactly made you think that you needed to fix these social problems that are going on around the world?
I think, as the opening questions alluded to, I grew up in the Melbourne Jewish community. For me, it's a Holocaust survivor community. I grew up in a Jewish environment, Jewish schooling. Everything was very much in the inheritance of genocide. And for me, the messaging that I got through all of my schooling about this thing we called tzedakah, which in English you would describe as charity, giving money, but the meaning of the word in Hebrew is actually righteousness, was instrumental. It makes me unable to, as I said earlier, do anything else and to remedy what befell my community.
Anybody else?
I'd like to take a stab at that question. It's really good. And I think it happens a lot, especially working internationally, where people say, we've got plenty of problems back home. Why are you over there, right? And that's very true. But I think because I had so much of my education internationally, and I saw myself as uniquely positioned to liaise between communities that what they ultimately need is resource and capacity development, and communities that could provide that. So that's sort of how I ended up in this, and I think that there's an added responsibility to make sure that we are doing it through the lens of recognizing that it is not sustainable for external parties to come in and try and fix things, that we need to do whatever we can to empower individuals in those communities to design their own solutions and to implement them themselves. That was a brilliant question.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
We'll go 1, 2, and 3. Sure.
The reason I'm personally involved in the social issues is because I see you as a brother. And if all of us see each other as brothers and sisters, as family, you'll do it.
Thank you. Vlad.
Well, I don't really change anything. They do. I just show, but I can tell you why I decide to do what I do, what drives me. So basically, if you can see, like most of my work, I go to places there or nobody goes, or it's really hard to get to, or there were some people, but I think the story has like, it needs to be told, like, you know. So for example, how did a Russian guy ended up in Papua New Guinea, for example? Yeah, well, I lived in Sydney for a while and it was too close, but then it came to me like, because I was reading something about this country, and then I found a report, well, really like 20 years old report from like Constitutional Commission of Papua New Guinea, with those numbers that in some areas, like in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, up to 99% of women at least once in their lifetime experience violence. Any sort, could be, you know, sexual violence, domestic violence, or even like physical or verbal. And as a visual guy, right, I go and look it up on the internet, and then I couldn't find the pictures, maybe one or two. The same with no rule. Visa is $8,000. No one can come. I'll go there. So if you need something from North Korea or Turkmenistan, call me.
All right. Kristy, take us home.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think mine is really based on the fact that the more I travel and the more people I see, I am incredibly lucky. I feel incredibly grateful to have had the upbringing and the position and even my genetics enough to have been able to want to go to do university and things like that. I think I'm incredibly lucky. I didn't have a particularly privileged background. I didn't travel until I was 22. So I still see people in other situations, and I see how much it's based on luck. And I feel incredibly lucky. And I think that there are a lot of people who aren't so lucky, and so I may as well use my luck to help them out as well. And so that's why I want to do what I do.
Thank you. And thanks for the great question. We are very much out of time. I think you'll agree we have some pretty incredible guys on this panel, so please do take advantage, talk to all of them afterwards, grab them in the coffee stand, abduct them on the way up the stairs. Please reach out. And in the meantime, please thank me in joining them for always thought-provoking and sometimes challenging responses. Thank you, panelists.